Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping quietly into the past, into narrow alleyways and muddy fields where football wasn't just a game, it was a problem. In this slow, sleepy journey, we'll explore a time when football was wild, lawless, and seen as dangerous, so much so that kings, councils, and even entire cities tried to erase it completely. But the people, they kept playing. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and drift with me into the story of how football was banned again and again, and how it never really disappeared. Football didn't just annoy kings and city officials, it also offended the church. In a world where spiritual order was considered more important than civil comfort, where festivals were rooted in saints' days, and morality was measured in silence and submission, football stood out like a blister. It was loud. It was violent. It made grown men howl and shove and forget themselves. And to many clergy, that made it dangerous. Not just physically, but morally. Let's go back again. Not to a battlefield or a throne room, but to the courtyard of a small stone church in a northern English village, sometime in the 1400s. The sermon has ended. The air is damp with incense. Villagers begin to scatter, their footsteps tapping over cobblestones. Then someone shouts. A pig's bladder hits the ground. Within moments, a dozen men are chasing it past the graveyard, between the hedges, and down the muddy lanes, knocking over baskets and laughing like children. It should have been a moment of calm reflection. Instead, it was a match. And for the priest, watching from the steps, it was an insult. Football disrupted the Sabbath. Thoth, Nakseftar. It turned the Lord's Day into a circus. It encouraged gambling, swearing, brawling, even drinking. And because it was most often played on Sundays and holy days, the only time working men were free, it became associated with unholiness. The church began to preach against it. Not metaphorically, literally. In parish after parish, priests gave sermons decrying football as a wicked pastime. In some regions, playing the game on a Sunday could get you flogged, fined, or locked in the stocks. One 16th century Puritan tract even warned that this football is a devil's delight, for by it men are cast into sin and into ditches. A game, they believed, should build virtue. Football, it seemed, built chaos. And then there was the poetry. Strange as it sounds, medieval England was filled with rhyming warnings about football. It was a favorite subject of social critics, moralists, and scholars who viewed the game as a symbol of everything that was wrong with common people. In one 15th century poem, footballers are described as bloody knaves with broken pates, chasing balls like senseless brutes. Their honor lost in cracked gates. These weren't gentle observations. They were attacks. To many in power, football wasn't just rowdy, it was unbecoming. A disorderly, unrefined spectacle that embarrassed the kingdom. Even playwrights poked fun. William Shakespeare, in King Lear, uses "you base football player" as an insult, implying that a man who played was coarse, brutish, and undignified. Still, the game thrived, especially in places where church power was weaker or communities had more freedom. But the criticism left its mark. In some regions, football became furtive, played in forests, behind barns, or deep in the hills where no sermon could reach. And as the game was pushed further from the mainstream, it became even more wild. There are stories of matches played through cemeteries, with goals made from church doors. Some players would smear themselves with soot or animal blood to intimidate opponents. Others sharpened their boots with nails, not to score, but to wound. The line between football and ritualized violence began to blur, and that was exactly the point. In a world where peasants had no control, where rules were handed down from pulpits and palaces, football was one of the few things they could own. It was theirs, sacred, in its own muddy, bleeding way. By the 1600s, the game had become a kind of cultural resistance. In towns where landowners banned play, entire villages would organize matches just to protest. Children would sneak balls into markets. Apprentices would use work breaks to pass it back and forth, laughing when scolded. And despite the sermons, despite the stocks and the punishments, football survived. Not because it was protected, but because it was loved. There's a famous story from a parish near Chester, told in old letters but never confirmed by records. It goes like this. A strict bishop arrived in town and immediately outlawed football. He called it a tool of the devil. Anyone caught playing would be jailed. The people obeyed. For 6 months, no one touched a ball. But on Easter Sunday, just as the bishop was walking to the chapel, the church bells rang 3 times and the entire village exploded into a match. From every alley, every rooftop, people ran shouting, barefoot, chasing a ball that had been hidden in the church's own tower. The bishop was knocked over by accident. His hat rolled into the mud, and the people said it was the greatest match they ever played. That's what made football unstoppable. Unstoppable. It wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. It was dirty, defiant, and absolutely human. It didn't belong to kings. It didn't belong to priests. It belonged to the crowd. And every time someone banned it, they only made it stronger. By the mid-1800s, 2 versions of football existed, side by side like twin shadows, one born of muddy streets and chaos, the other of neatly mowed school lawns and handwritten rule books. The first was tradition, wild, untamed, and filled with spirit. The second was invention, orderly, codified, and aimed at shaping character. Eventually, they would collide. And out of that collision, something entirely new would emerge. Not just a game, but the most popular sport the world has ever known. Let's set the scene. England, 1850. Railways are crisscrossing the countryside. Gas lamps flicker in the foggy streets of London. The factories are roaring. And in the shadow of all this industry, something strange is happening. Football is moving indoors. Not literally, but organizationally. Schools, colleges, and clubs are forming their own teams, complete with their own sets of rules. A young man could go from playing at Harrow to Cambridge and find that his version of football was considered illegal by someone else's code. At Eton, the emphasis was on dribbling and blocking with the body. At rugby, you could handle the ball and tackle like a brawler. At Harrow, the pitch was sloped and full of obstacles, with games often taking place during snowfall. These weren't organized leagues. There were no trophies, no fans. But slowly, year by year, the chaotic mess of folk football was being formalized. And once rules were written, people started to notice. The turning point came in the early 1800s. Educators and reformers, men who once viewed football as a vice, began to see something else in it: discipline, teamwork, fitness, leadership, qualities useful for factory workers, for soldiers, for citizens. Football had gone from street riot to moral training ground, and for the first time in its long, chaotic history, it began to be encouraged. But the old game still lingered. In rural villages, people weren't playing Eton's football or rugby's version. They were playing their own. No rules, no teams, just chaos and tradition. In some towns, a ball would be passed between 300 people, from one riverbank to another, over fences, through barns, past children and dogs and shouting neighbors. It was messy. It was ancient, and in many places, still technically illegal. By the 1840s, the tension reached a boiling point. You had 2 footballs, had the elite, rule-bound, morally acceptable game taught in schools, and the ancient, muddy, beautiful mess still being played by farmers and weavers and coal miners. Both used balls. Both had goals. But only one was allowed to exist in the open. There's a story from 1846 in Ashbourne, Derbyshire, where the townspeople had played their traditional Shrovetide football match for over 600 years. That year, the local authorities tried to ban it again. They put guards on rooftops, they locked up the ball, they warned that anyone caught playing would be arrested. But the people came anyway. They made their own ball, they hid it in a bread cart, and when the bell rang, the game began like thunder. Dozens were injured. The ball was lost in the river, then found, then kicked down a street so hard it shattered a butcher's window. The town square was chaos, and yet it was perfect. Because in that match, like hundreds before it, football wasn't just survival, it was identity. By the early 1700s, the world was beginning to change. Cities were growing, roads were improving, new machines were humming in distant workshops, and the old medieval world, with its plagues, parishes, and peasant rebellions, was slowly giving way to something colder, faster, and more organized. But football was still being chased down village lanes, still muddy, still banned, still alive. At this point, the game had survived over 300 years of suppression. Kings had banned it, bishops had condemned it, laws had punished it, and yet every Shrove Tuesday, every Saint's Day, every slow market afternoon, people played. They kicked ragged balls made of stitched leather or rolled up cloth. They shouted from rooftops. They gathered in fields that had once been battlefields. Sometimes there were goals, sometimes not. Sometimes there were teams. Sometimes it was everyone against everyone. But always, always, there was passion. And that was the problem, because England was beginning to demand order. The Industrial Revolution had begun. Towns were turning into cities, farms into factories, fields into fences. And with this new world came a new fear, not of rebellion, but of disruption. Factory owners didn't want workers injuring themselves in matches. Teachers didn't want students skipping lessons for local games. Landowners didn't want their hedges trampled and their sheep scattered. Football, unpredictable, rough, defiant, suddenly looked like a relic of a wild, undisciplined past. In 1789, a small town in Derbyshire banned football, not for violence, but for inconveniencing the local traffic. That traffic, horse carts, the world was speeding up, and football was in the way. But here's the twist. This age of control of time clocks and factory bells didn't kill the game. It reshaped it. Because even as traditional folk football was being squeezed out of city centers and commons, something new was quietly forming behind high stone walls: public schools. Now, don't let the term fool you. In England, public school meant elite private academies, Eton, Harrow, Rugby, schools for the sons of landowners, politicians, and wealthy merchants. And inside those schools, the boys were restless, bored, competitive, rebellious in their own way. And so, many of them started to play football. Only this time, they did something strange. They began writing rules. Each school had its own version. At Eton, you could touch the ball with your hands, but only to stop it. At Rugby, you could pick it up and run, a version that would later evolve into rugby football. At Harrow, the pitch was sloped and full of obstacles, with games often taking place during snowfall. These weren't organized leagues. There were no trophies, no fans. But slowly, year by year, the chaotic mess of folk football was being formalized. And once rules were written, people started to notice. The turning point came in the early 1800s. Educators and reformers, men who once viewed football as a vice, began to see something else in it: discipline, teamwork, fitness, leadership, qualities useful for factory workers, for soldiers, for citizens. Football had gone from street riot to moral training ground, and for the first time in its long, chaotic history, it began to be encouraged. But the old game still lingered. In rural villages, people weren't playing Eton's football or Rugby's version. They were playing their own, No rules, no teams, just chaos and tradition. In some towns, a ball would be passed between 300 people, from one river bank to another, over fences, through barns, past children and dogs, and shouting neighbors. It was messy. It was ancient. And in many places, still technically illegal. By the 1840s, the tension reached a boiling point. You had two footballs. The elite, rule-bound, morally acceptable game taught in schools, and the ancient, muddy, beautiful mess still being played by farmers and weavers and coal miners. Both used balls. Both had goals. But only one was allowed to exist in the open. There's a story from 1846 in Ashbourne, Derbyshire, where the townspeople had played their traditional Shrovetide football match for over 600 years. That year, the local authorities tried to ban it again. They put guards on rooftops. They locked up the ball. They warned that anyone caught playing would be arrested. But the people came anyway. They made their own ball. They hid it in a bread cart. And when the bell rang, the game began like thunder. Dozens were injured. The ball was lost in the river, then found, then kicked down a street so hard it shattered a butcher's window. The town square was chaos. And yet, it was perfect. Because in that match, like hundreds before it, football wasn't just survival. It was identity. The world was coming apart. Plagues swept through towns, leaving graveyards overfilled. Harvests failed, war rose, and fell like bad weather. Entire villages disappeared, swallowed by disease or debt. And yet, somewhere, every few miles, someone was still kicking a ball. Still playing football, still breaking the rules, and sometimes themselves to keep something alive. Because by the 17th century, football was no longer just a game of rebellion. It had become a kind of anchor. A tradition older than most laws, more familiar than most kings, and more beloved than any sermon. It was one of the few things that made people feel alive, even when the world felt doomed. Let's go to 1631. England is still tense from political turmoil. Rumors swirl about uprisings. In one small northern village, records show that 3 men were arrested for organizing an unlawful game of football during Lent. But this wasn't just rule-breaking. It was a funeral. One of the men's brothers had died of plague, and according to old letters, they honored him not with mourning, but with a match. They played on the common green, just as he would have wanted. Dozens joined, despite the threat of arrest. And when the town guard came to disperse the game, the ball was hidden, passed between sleeves and aprons, until the final goal was scored hours later. They played for grief, for joy, for memory. That was the quiet power of football. It could be sacred, without being solemn. It could carry mourning inside motion. There were towns where matches were held after weddings, and others where they were held after executions, to celebrate, to forget, to cope. It had become a form of collective emotional release, a pressure valve for a world that had very few. And still, the bans kept coming. In the late 1600s, the Puritans rose to power, and their grip on culture was suffocating. Sports, music, dancing, anything that distracted from God or duty was suspect. Football became a primary target. Why? Because it refused to obey. A church record from Devon noted, grimly, "The congregation did scatter after morning prayer, most wickedly engaging in football with shouts and blows, as though beasts in a field." You can hear the tone in those words. Football wasn't just disliked, it was feared. Feared for its passion, feared for its popularity, feared because it couldn't be erased. And the more the elite tried to outlaw it, the more symbolic it became. In small towns, people began to build traditions around the ban itself. There were villages where the football was passed from house to house like a relic, protected from prying eyes, There were secret signals, a bell rung at the wrong time, or a dog let loose in the street that told people a match was about to begin. In some communities, children played football in cemeteries, weaving around headstones, believing the dead would protect them from punishment. In others, the ball was smuggled into churchyards and kicked across sacred ground, not in disrespect, but in quiet defiance of rules that didn't make sense. It wasn't just sport. It was survival. It was culture. It was memory. A traveler in the 1680s wrote of stopping in a village near York on a stormy afternoon. He found a group of men, soaked and shivering, still playing football in the rain, their boots caked in mud and their knuckles bleeding. When he asked why they didn't stop, why they didn't wait for sun or dry ground, the oldest man simply said, "We play now, or we don't play at all." Because they never knew when the next ban would come, when the next priest would shut the gate, when the next soldier would ride through. So they played while they could, even if it meant freezing, even if it meant bleeding, even if it meant punishment. The deeper truth was this: football was one of the only things that belonged to the people. They had no say in taxes, no say in land, no say in law, but they could say, together, "We're playing." And no amount of decrees could take that away, not entirely. Even when laws were written, even when punishments were issued, even when churches rang bells in warning. Somewhere, in the forest, on the common, behind the hedgerow, a ball was moving. This wasn't the football of polished rules and bright green pitches. This was something rougher, older, truer, a thing passed down like stories, kicked forward through generations, across centuries of fire and frost. And even if the world tried to silence it, they never could. The year is 1572, and the streets of England are still rattling with the sounds of football. Not stadium chants, not organized cheers, but bare feet, clattering boots, and angry shouting in the lanes. Queen Elizabeth I is on the throne. Her face, immortalized in portraiture, is calm and regal. But beyond the palace gates, the country is a mess of tensions. Religious strife, economic hardship, rumors of rebellion. And underneath it all, football continues to boil. Still rowdy, still unregulated, still uncontrollable. For the Tudor monarchs, this wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was becoming an issue of state, because the more chaotic the country felt, the more dangerous football seemed. Why? Because football wasn't just played in the countryside anymore. It had reached the cities, and worse, the crowded slums where apprentices, servants, and out-of-work men gathered in tight groups and rough moods. And when those men started playing, matches often turned into riots. One historian described 16th century football as a moving mob with a ball at its center. And that's no exaggeration. Picture it: over 100 players tearing down the streets of Norwich, pushing each other, crashing into carts, breaking fences, startling horses. Markets would shut down, pubs would barricade their doors, residents would literally hide indoors until the match passed. Sometimes it ended in laughter, sometimes in blood. In 1572, a law was passed under Elizabeth's rule, allowing footballers to be punished as criminals, not for playing per se, but for the unlawful assemblies it created. In the eyes of the crown, a football match was no different than a protest. It gathered people, it stirred emotion, it distracted from obedience, and that made it a political threat. Throughout the Tudor and early Stuart periods, football was specifically banned in city charters, military garrisons, and royal schools. Soldiers could not play it. Scholars were forbidden from joining matches. Even servants of noble households were instructed not to participate. The punishment? Anything from whipping to dismissal. But still, people played. The bans grew harsher. In 1608, a match in Manchester ended in violence. The mayor petitioned for a formal ban, claiming football had caused great disorder and loss of life. The town passed an ordinance making play illegal within the borough limits, under penalty of fine. And yet the ball kept rolling. In fact, the stricter the laws became, the more elaborate the matches grew. Teams began to organize around guilds, neighborhoods, or parishes. Some towns developed traditions where one side of the river played against the other, turning the match into a kind of civic war. Balls were crafted with thicker leather. Players trained in secret. Children joined in, cheering from rooftops. It's worth asking, why? Why would people risk punishment, even injury, for this game? Because in a society that was so stratified, so repressed, so obsessed with status and silence, football was one of the few outlets that felt free. There were no noble titles on the field, no sermons, no taxes, just mud, laughter, bruises, and pride. For 90 minutes, or 3 hours, or however long the madness lasted, you weren't a peasant or a pauper, you were a player. And the ball was the only thing that mattered. By the early 1600s, the game had become almost mythic in rural life. In one town, Shrove Tuesday was considered ball day, where every man, woman, and child was expected to join in the chaos. Old stories tell of bakers shutting their ovens early, schoolmasters canceling lessons, and local lords fleeing their estates just to avoid the crowds. One witness described a match where entire flocks of sheep were swept into the game, pushed along by the mob until the ball eventually came to rest in a barnyard. It was funny, it was dangerous, and it was utterly unstoppable. Still, the monarchy persisted. By the time James I came to power in 1603, England was shifting again. A new dynasty, new rules, and new anxiety. Football, to James, was more than rowdy, it was ungodly. In his Basilicon Doron, a treatise on kingship, James advised his son to avoid games of violence, football in particular, because they were nothing but beastly fury and extreme cruelty. And yet, that didn't stop people from playing right outside royal courts. In some towns, it became a kind of performance of defiance, villagers deliberately scheduling matches during royal visits. One match in Cornwall was so loud it interrupted a nobleman's speech, resulting in the players being jailed for 3 nights. When they were released, they played again. Football was not just recreation. It was a kind of resistance, a noisy, muddy, bruised rebellion against silence and control. And despite decades of legal effort, royal displeasure, and clerical scolding, it would not go away. Hey there. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when football wasn't a game, it was a crime. Not the polished sport we know today, but a muddy, lawless ritual so unruly, kings outlawed it, churches condemned it, and yet the people kept playing. This is the secret war between power and play, the long, quiet battle over a ball. Let's begin. They say the earliest known football ban in England was issued in the year 1314. Picture it, a gray dawn over medieval London. The streets are narrow, twisted. Smoke drifts from cook fires. Merchants are just beginning to open their stalls, and somewhere, in the stillness between bell tolls, there's the distant thud of a ball hitting stone. Not a modern ball, not stitched leather filled with air, but something cruder, a pig's bladder tied at both ends, wobbling through the dirt as a group of boys charge after it, kicking and shouting down a cobbled lane. It's loud, it's disorderly, and to the mayor of London, it's a problem. So on April 13th, 1314, he issued a formal decree. There is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls from which many evils might arise. And just like that, football became illegal. But why? Why would a ball game played mostly by peasants, apprentices, and bored young men provoke such official outrage? To understand, you have to forget everything you know about modern football. There were no referees, no pitches, no jerseys or sponsorships or glory. There were just two goals, often miles apart, and a crowd of men, sometimes hundreds, sprinting, tackling, screaming, and chasing a ball through alleys, across fields, over hedgerows, and sometimes through cemeteries. The ball itself was often made of stitched leather or inflated stomach lining. It had no standard size. Some were no bigger than a fist. Others were so large they had to be carried like logs. The matches were not scheduled, they were not approved, and they didn't always end. They simply collapsed when someone got injured badly enough or when the town guard finally broke it up. And that chaos is why football was banned. It wasn't just a game, it was a threat. Thoth and Sterret Road Prad. To order, to safety, to authority. In medieval England, stability was fragile. The monarchy had power, but that power was stretched thin. Cities were crowded, filthy, and tense. A single fire could take down a street. A brawl could spark a rebellion. And football was chaos by design. It brought together large groups of commoners in unsupervised, emotionally charged situations. People got hurt. Shop windows were smashed. Property was damaged. Entire markets would shut down if a match wandered through. In some towns, the game blurred with riot. And when you're a king or a bishop or a mayor trying to maintain control, the line between sport and insurrection matters a great deal. But there was another reason the game was feared. A reason deeper than broken windows or bruised ribs. Football distracted men from war. At the time, England was locked in near constant military tension. With Scotland, with France, with itself. Every able-bodied man was expected to practice archery, a skill considered vital to national defense. In 1363, King Edward III issued a decree banning handball, football, or hockey, coursing and cockfighting, or other such idle games, because, he said, they distracted men from their archery practice. This wasn't about keeping people safe, it was about keeping them ready. A man kicking a ball down a lane was a man not drawing a longbow. A village match was a threat not only to law and order, but to England's military preparedness. And so the game was suppressed again. By the 1400s, it had become a cycle. Football would grow in popularity, especially during feasts, festivals, and holidays. The authorities would panic. Someone would get injured, or worse, a barn would be burned, a bishop would be knocked down by accident, and then the game would be banned. Again and again. 1496, 1510, 1540. Over and over, monarchs and magistrates tried to stamp it out. And yet, it never quite died. Because the bans didn't erase the love for the game. They just pushed it underground. Matches were arranged in whispers. Balls were hidden in barns. Teams used fake festivals as cover. And some towns even passed the ball from village to village, making it impossible for authorities to pin down a single location. There's a story, never confirmed, always told in pubs, that in one village, a priest banned football so often and so forcefully that the local boys buried the ball in a churchyard and replaced it with a new one each week. When the priest finally left, they dug up a dozen old balls and held the first match of spring with all of them at once. Football was loud, it was rough, it was foolish, but it was also joyful. And that joy, however muddy, however reckless, was something worth protecting, even in defiance. Hey there. Tonight, we drift back to the 1800s, to a time when football was no longer just something played in the muddy streets or hidden from the law, but something quietly organizing itself. This is the story of how the game that once ran wild through villages and back alleys slowly began to take root in factories, in churches, in pubs, and in the working heart of England. So settle in, take a breath, and let's begin where the clubs first began, with the people who had nothing and yet still built everything. By the middle of the 19th century, the soul of football had changed. No longer just the chaotic brawls of Shrovetide or the forbidden joy of village greens, football was starting to settle into something steadier, something that could be played regularly, with purpose. What was once outlawed had become tolerated. What was once played in secret was now practiced openly, especially in one very specific place, the factory. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, England was roaring with machinery. Men worked 12-hour days in textile mills, steel forges, and shipyards. Coal dust filled their lungs, sweat soaked their shirts. For many, life was little more than work and sleep. But on the weekend came football. It started small. A few men from the same mill kicking a ball in an open lot. Nothing official, just motion, laughter, release. But as word spread, something unexpected happened. Other factories began doing the same. And soon, the men who labored together from sunrise to sunset began playing together on their day off. They wore mismatched shirts. The field might have been gravel or the edge of a railway clearing. There were no fans, no referees, no sponsors. But there was a ball. There were teammates, and there was pride. You weren't just playing to win. You were playing for the name of your mill, for your street, for your trade. This was where the first sparks of club identity began. Take the town of Sheffield, for example. In 1857, two friends, Nathaniel Creswick and William Prest, decided to start a formal football club for members of their local cricket team to stay active in the off-season. They called it the Sheffield Football Club, and it became the first officially recognized football club in the world. But they weren't professionals. There was no money involved, just structure. They drafted rules, agreed on meeting days, and even wrote down match reports. Others took notice. Over the next decade, dozens of small clubs began to emerge, not just in big cities like London or Birmingham, but in smaller industrial towns like Stoke, Derby, and Blackburn. Many of these clubs were formed by churches, hoping to give boys a moral pastime. Pubs, using teams to build loyalty among locals. Schools, carrying forward traditions from elite institutions. And most importantly, factories, where workmates became teammates. This new form of football was growing roots. It had regular training days. It had internal leadership. It even had early versions of uniforms, usually hand-sewn sashes or badges to distinguish teams. It wasn't just play anymore. It was community. But in these early years, something else was happening too. Something a little quieter. Football was teaching people how to organize. It taught leadership. It taught teamwork. It gave men who had no voice in Parliament a voice in a locker room. You might not be able to vote, but you could be a captain. You could form a committee. You could choose your colors, your pitch, your strategy. In a world that crushed individuality, football offered the working class ownership of something bigger than themselves. And slowly, match by match, these clubs began playing each other. Informal games turned into fixtures. Pubs drew chalkboards to list scores. Churches hosted matches as charity events. A local mill might play a rival warehouse. A church team might travel to a neighboring town and return with a trophy carved from wood. These weren't huge events. Not yet. But in their smallness was everything. Thoth was they were building a culture. They were building belonging. And with every match, something else began to form in the air, something unspoken but deeply felt. Loyalty. A man might break his ankle at work and be forgotten by payday. But if he broke it, scoring the winning goal, he'd be remembered for years. His name would echo in the pub, in the locker room, in the stories passed down. Football was no longer just a game. It was identity, ritual, and escape. And the clubs were its temples. By the time the 1880s rolled into the industrial towns of England, football was no longer just a weekend novelty. It was a ritual. Each Saturday, factory whistles signaled more than the end of the shift. They signaled the beginning of something sacred. Streets emptied, boots were laced, and thousands marched through fog and cinder smoke toward fields of packed dirt and makeshift stands. The FA Cup had sparked the fire, but something more permanent was needed. A structure, a rhythm, a way to keep score beyond one trophy a year. And so, in a smoky meeting room above a pub in Manchester, 12 clubs came together in 1888. The idea was simple: not just more matches, but a league, a season, a table, a system where teams could rise and fall based on performance, not status. It was revolutionary. The man behind it all was William McGregor, a Scottish draper and club director for Aston Villa. He'd grown tired of inconsistent scheduling, teams pulling out of fixtures or refusing to travel or simply canceling with no warning. He wanted order. He wanted fairness. And above all, he wanted to protect the clubs that had begun pouring their heart and wages into the game. So he proposed something radical: a group of teams who would commit to playing each other home and away in a full, organized season, with points, with standings, with consequences. The 12 founding clubs of the Football League were a mix of rising powers: Accrington, Aston Villa, Blackburn Rovers, Bolton Wanderers. He was two-mouthed Tubal, Bolton, Iber the Time, Amidas Tidjum, Amidas Tubal, 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 Amidas Tubal. Burnley, Derby County, Everton, Iverton, Volnovertongue, Notts County, Preston North End, Stoke, West Bromwich Albion, Wolverhampton Wanderers. They were mill towns and market towns, clubs born in pubs, churches, and factories. Each brought something different. But they all agreed on one thing: it was time for football to grow up. The first league season kicked off in September of 1888. There were no television crews, no screaming commentators, no plastic seats or pre-match fireworks. But there was tension. There was pride. Each match carried new meaning. Wins and losses weren't just bragging rights anymore. They were measurable progress. Preston, North End, nicknamed the Invincibles, would go on to win that first league season without losing a single match. They scored 74 goals and conceded only 15 across 22 games. It was dominance, but it was also a new kind of benchmark. For the first time, clubs had data, something to chase, to compare, to improve. You could finish top or bottom. You could climb, or you could fall. It made every game matter. The Football League also introduced a concept that we take for granted today: promotion and relegation. If you performed poorly, you risked being replaced by a better team waiting below. It created urgency, and it allowed ambitious lower-tier clubs to dream of climbing the ladder. This system kept football alive in dozens of small towns. Even if a club couldn't afford stars, Even if it played on a sloped pitch behind a slaughterhouse, it could, in theory, rise to the top. It gave football the thing it needed most: hope. As the league expanded, more divisions were added. By the 1890s, clubs like Liverpool, Sheffield United, and Newton Heath, later known as Manchester United, joined the mix. Some were founded specifically to play in the league. Others had been small-time teams suddenly thrust into national attention. The crowds grew too. Where once a few hundred fans stood on crates, now thousands packed into grounds like Goodison Park, Edgewood Park, and Villa Park. The chants became louder. The songs became tradition. And entire communities began to structure their lives around match day. But with structure came pressure. Owners began seeking better players. Better players required wages. Wages required income. And so football became more than just a pastime. It became an industry. Ticket prices were introduced. Club merchandise began to appear. And newspapers assigned full-time reporters to cover matches. A new role was born: the supporter, not just someone who watched, but someone who belonged. Clubs became tribes. Colors became identities. And chants became battle cries. Aston Villa was claret and blue. Everton was royal blue. Sunderland wore red and white. And each club had a story, one passed from father to son, from pub to pub, from terrace to terrace. By the end of the 19th century, the Football League had over 30 clubs. Rules had been codified. Referees had whistles. Linesmen had flags. And football had arrived, not just in muddy fields and pub backrooms, but in the heart of British life. If you walk the cobbled streets of an old English town early enough, before the shops open and the cars wake up, you might still hear it. The hum of history. A faint echo, not of war or politics, but of footsteps. Boots on gravel, laughter in the fog, the quiet thud of a leather ball against a crumbling wall. The game that once belonged to boys and butchers, shipbuilders and shepherds, has never really left. It's just changed its clothes. Today, football is a global phenomenon. Billion-dollar deals, stadiums like cathedrals, jerseys sold on every continent. But hidden beneath that shine, under the turf, behind the sponsorship banners, inside the roar, is the same old story. Men and women building something together. Something they believe in. Something they pass down. Something worth caring about, no matter how silly it looks from the outside. Because football clubs were never just clubs. They were escape from long weeks and broken backs. Identity in a world that gave people numbers, not names. Family, for those who had none. And hope, wrapped in cloth and stitched in colors that meant home. The first football clubs weren't founded for fame. They were formed by need. A need to play. A need to belong. A need to shout and sing and breathe beneath gray skies and rising smokestacks. And that spirit? It never left. You can still see it in small clubs today. In the 7-year-old in mud-stained socks, waving at his dad in the stands. In the old man who hasn't missed a home game since 1964, even when it rained sideways. In the woman who sells pies out of a shack, humming the club anthem between customers. In the teenager who paints banners by hand, even though the club hasn't won in 3 months. That's the legacy. Not the trophies, not the broadcast rights, but the ordinary people who made it all possible. And when you look at today's giants, Manchester United, Arsenal, Liverpool, Aston Villa, remember, Manchester United started as a railway team. Arsenal was formed by workers in a munitions factory. Liverpool was born out of a disagreement over rent. Aston Villa came from 4 cricketers who wanted to stay busy in winter. None of them were built to last. And yet, here they are, watched by billions, carried forward by songs older than their stadium roofs. That's not marketing. That's memory. Football's roots have always been in the mud, in second-hand boots, in chalk lines drawn by hand, in friends who didn't need a ref to know when to stop. And while the game has changed with VR and transfer windows, agents and analytics, its soul remains oddly simple. A team, a ball, a dream. Maybe that's why people still cry when their club wins, or scream when it loses, or tattoo the crest on their skin. Or it's not just about the match. It's about belonging to something older than you and knowing you'll still be part of it long after you're gone. Because somewhere, right now, a kid is being handed his first kit. He doesn't know who Billy Bassett was. He's never heard of the muddy field behind the tannery in 1888. But when he pulls that shirt over his head, he's part of the story. The same story. The one that started in the back of a pub with a scribbled fixture list and a borrowed ball. The one that lives on in chants and scarves and Saturdays. The one we've told tonight. The story of how the first football clubs were formed and how they never really disappeared. They just grew alongside the people who needed them most. Thanks for staying with me. You can rest now, or you can continue listening to the next story. The Football League had brought order. The FA Cup had brought ambition. But something deeper had taken root, something far harder to measure. Myth. As the 20th century neared, the clubs that once gathered in dusty fields behind mills were now building legacies. And with them came names. Names whispered in pubs, painted on banners, etched into local memory like saints in stained glass. Take Billy Bassett, for example. A wiry, quick-footed winger for West Bromwich Albion in the 1880s, Billy became one of the sport's first stars, not because he was flashy, but because he played like the crowd felt gritty, determined, joyful. When he had the ball, fans leaned forward. When he scored, entire neighborhoods sang his name. He didn't wear designer boots. He wore leather, heavy, mud-soaked, the kind that bruised your ankles by halftime. But Billy wasn't just playing for points. He was playing for pride. That was true of most early club legends. They weren't celebrities. They were neighbors. They fixed watches, drove trams, worked in mines. And on Saturdays, they transformed into giants, not on television screens, but in the eyes of the people. You'd pass them in the street and nod. Not because they were rich, but because they'd scored the winner last week against your bitterest rivals. Football was turning stories into loyalty, and the clubs became something sacred. Think about that. A shirt with 2 stripes and a stitched-on badge could now mean more than a flag or a coin. If you supported Everton, you didn't just like the team. You were Everton. When they lost, you felt it. When they won, the whole block cheered. You weren't buying a ticket. You were participating in a memory. Some of the most powerful club identities came from how they were formed. Woolwich Arsenal was born from a weapons factory. Manchester United, then Newton Heath, from railway workers. Sheffield Wednesday, from a cricket club that only played on Wednesdays. West Ham United, from the Thames Ironworks shipyard. Each club had a story, a voice, a smell, even of coal, fog, sweat, pie crusts, and grat. But the game wasn't without its growing pains. Some clubs folded under financial pressure. Others merged, changed names, or relocated. Rivalries turned fierce, sometimes violent. Supporters threw bricks instead of hats. Pitches were stormed, matches abandoned. The passion was real. But so were the consequences of attaching so much meaning to a ball and a badge. Still, the love never faded, because in every battered stand, every smudged program, every muddy pair of boots, the game was alive. By the early 1900s, professional players were earning a wage. Not a fortune. Don't, but enough to feed a family. Some clubs began signing players from Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, importing skill, raising competition. The league expanded again. New divisions, more fixtures. Football was quickly becoming the national pastime. Factories gave half-days on match days. Local trains ran special football lines to carry fans. Kids kicked stones on cobblestones, pretending they were Dixie Dean, and clubs took care of their own. Many opened benevolent funds, money set aside to help injured players or widows of teammates. Some ran community kitchens during tough winters. Others formed youth teams, offering boys a path out of poverty. Because football wasn't just about performance anymore. It was about purpose. In towns like Sunderland, Burnley, and Bury, football clubs became the heartbeat of the place. You could walk down the high street and feel the week's result in the air. A win made the bakery warmer. A loss made the pub more bitter. No matter how bad the week had been, low wages, bad weather, broken boots. Saturday was always waiting. And still, the myths kept growing. Stories of last-minute goals, impossible saves, muddy miracles. Players who ran through injuries. Coaches who gave halftime speeches that changed lives. These weren't fairy tales. They were folk tales, told by grandfathers to grandsons, by neighbors over fences. And all of them came from the clubs. Those beautiful, ragtag, working-class institutions built on borrowed land and blind hope. The year is 1871. The streets of London are lit by gas lamps. The industrial smoke curls in the evening sky. And down a narrow road in Holborn, a meeting is taking place that will quietly change the course of football forever. 12 men gather around a table. They sip tea, they clear their throats, and one of them says the words that would echo through history. We should create a cup. Not a cup for tea, not a symbol of politeness, but a trophy, one to be won. A prize that would pull together all these loose clubs, scattered across counties and class lines, into one nationwide competition. And that's how the FA Cup was born. Before this, football was still local. Clubs played other nearby teams, rivals they knew by name, men who worked in the same factories or prayed in the same churches. But the idea of a national match? It was unheard of. There were no trains designed to carry entire teams, no press to cover a cross-country tournament, and certainly no single set of rules that everyone followed perfectly. Still, the idea of a cup called to them. Something to strive for. Something to bind this growing sport into a shared story. In 1871, the very first FA Cup began. 15 teams signed up. Some were school clubs. Some were military regiments. Some were from London's suburbs. And most had never traveled far for a game before. The matches were uneven. Some were walkovers. Others were gritty battles played in icy fields with goalposts made from rope and sticks. But with every round, the idea became real. That first final was held in 1872 at the Kennington Oval, a cricket ground better known for hosting matches in summer whites than muddy boots. A club called the Wanderers won, not because they were the richest or the strongest, but because they were organized. They trained together. They passed more than they dribbled. They approached football as a system, not a scrap. It was a turning point. The crowd was small, just over 2,000 people, but the seed had been planted. From that moment forward, football wasn't just about playing. It was about winning something real. The cup gave clubs a goal beyond their village. Suddenly, a small team from Derby could dream of facing a regiment from Woolwich. A factory squad in Sheffield could imagine beating the London elite. And this changed everything. Clubs began formalizing. recruiting more committed players, hiring secretaries to manage fixtures, holding training sessions, creating written constitution, charging small membership fees, choosing team colors, and even crests. It was the beginning of modern club infrastructure. And then, the spectators came. Not in a flood at first, but steadily. By the late 1870s, thousands of people were turning up for big matches. Local pubs overflowed. Newspaper reports printed scores in bold type. Merchants started selling scarves and badges. Football had gone from a sideline to a public spectacle. And with that came something inevitable. Money. Many of the early clubs were still amateur. Players were unpaid. The ethos was one of fair play and sportsmanship. But in towns like Preston, Blackburn, and Sunderland, places where life was hard and time was precious, clubs began quietly paying players. It started as covering travel expenses. Then compensation for lost wages. Then, very plainly, as salaries. This was controversial. The Fae pushed back. They threatened suspensions. They said professionalism would corrupt the soul of the game, but they couldn't stop it. Because football had outgrown its gentleman's garden, it was now the people's game. One of the first clubs to embrace professionalism openly was Blackburn Rovers. They drew players from the working class. They trained like a real team. And in 1884, they became the first working-class club to win the FA Cup, breaking a streak of elite amateur champions. It was a message heard across the country. You didn't need privilege to succeed in football. You just needed unity, grit, and the will to play. And that win wasn't a fluke. Blackburn would go on to dominate the cup for years, proving that football had truly shifted. The power was no longer in London. It had moved north to the textile towns and steel cities where the game had always quietly lived in the mud. By the end of the 1880s, there were dozens of competitive clubs, clubs with fans, clubs with nicknames, clubs with chants and flags, and rivalries that could fill a whole afternoon with tension. The groundwork had been laid for something even bigger, a full league. But that would come a little later. For now, football was no longer just a pastime. It was an institution. By the 1860s, football clubs were spreading like the roots of an old oak tree, quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of England's bustling towns. Each one was a little different. Some wore colors passed down from family crests. Others played on borrowed school grounds. Some used barrels as goalposts. And others had matches that doubled as church fundraisers or local harvest celebrations. There were no agents, no press, no sponsorships, but there were rivalries. And those rivalries, they mattered. Picture a match in 1865, a Sunday afternoon, in a smoky Midlands town. The players gather on a patch of common land, boots worn, and jerseys homemade. One team is from a factory known for its rough iron workers. The other is from a church choir down the road. The whistle isn't a whistle at all, just a sharp yell from a man in a long coat. But when the game begins, it's war. Sliding tackles through the mud, shouts echoing between chimneys, the ball bouncing wildly off tree roots and puddles. Children perch on walls to watch. Old women cheer from doorways. And when someone scores, there's no announcer. Just a roar, raw and unfiltered. These early matches were more than competition. They were ceremony. Rituals formed. A pre-match pint at the local pub. Songs invented to mock rivals. Coin tosses with buttons instead of coins. Players kneeling in prayer before kickoff. Home fans presenting loaves of bread or jugs of ale to visiting teams. The game was becoming culture. Some of the earliest rivalries were born out of neighborhood pride. When two clubs played from opposite ends of the same town, it wasn't just football, it was identity on the line. One street might house weavers, the next, steelmen. One supported the pub team, the other, the chapel boys. And when they met, it felt like history was being written in the mud. Let's take a closer look at Notts County, officially founded in 1862. They're now recognized as the oldest professional football club in existence. But back then, they were just a group of locals, cricketers, clerks, and curious boys gathering in a field near Nottingham Castle. They wore black and white. They brought their own balls. They had no league, no money, and barely any rules, but they had each other. And that was enough to build a legacy. At the same time, clubs like Stoke Ramblers, Derby Town, and Sheffield Wednesday began forming, not because someone had a brilliant idea, but because people wanted to keep playing. Men moved from town to town for work and brought the game with them. One man's team folded when a mill closed, only to be reborn in another village the following year. Football wasn't just spreading, it was being carried. Like a story, like a hymn. It's easy now to look back and see only the legends, the stadiums, the stars, the trophies. But in these early days, a football club wasn't a business. It was a brotherhood. Players stitched their own kits. They played through injuries. They walked miles to matches and got home in the dark. And when they lost, they still went to the pub together, to laugh, to argue, to plan the next match. Slowly, rules became more consistent. Some clubs adopted the Cambridge rules, which banned running with the ball in hand, helping distinguish football from rugby. Others preferred the new Football Association Code from London. Not everyone agreed, but that didn't stop the game. If a club wanted to play someone with different rules, they'd often compromise. Half the match under one set, half under another, or simply agree to ignore a few rules and settle it like gentlemen. The important thing wasn't perfection. It was continuity. As the 1870s approached, a new type of club began to appear. Church-sponsored clubs. Vicars and parish leaders, seeing how popular the game was among boys and laborers, began forming teams under religious banners. Their goal, to keep young men out of trouble. And in many ways, it worked. It gave purpose. It gave structure. And soon, these church clubs were producing some of the finest teams in the country. One of them, formed in 1874 by a chapel in Birmingham, would one day become Aston Villa. Through these church clubs, football began attracting spectators, wives, children, neighbors. The pitch became a gathering place. A muddy, uneven field surrounded by people in shawls and top hats. There were no bleachers, no security fences, just community. And that's the word that kept coming back. Community. These clubs weren't just about football. They were about belonging. They were about having something to cheer for in a world that often gave the working class very little else. They were about standing shoulder to shoulder with people you trusted and pushing a ball through rain, wind, and smoke-stained air. And slowly, the clubs, these messy, beautiful, passionate clubs, began to shape the future of football. Hey there. Tonight, we're heading into one of the most forgotten corners of football history. A place where the grass went quiet and the cheers faded. This is the story of how the beautiful game faced its darkest hour and survived. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. And let's drift back to a time when football stopped, not because anyone wanted it to, but because the world went to war. The year was 1914, and across England, Saturday afternoons were sacred. Men gathered in smoky pubs, boys kicked balls through alleyways, and football stadiums echoed with chants that rang out like church bells. The sport had grown wildly since its muddy beginnings in village fields. Clubs were formalized, leagues had structure, and fans followed their teams with fierce loyalty. But that August, the cheering stopped, because war came knocking. At first, no one believed it would last long. "The boys will be back by Christmas," they said. And so, for a few brief weeks, football carried on, almost defiantly. Early season matches were still played, stadiums still filled, but tension hung in the air like the mist on the pitch. Recruitment posters were plastered outside turnstiles. Military parades passed by goalposts. Then came the letter from the Football Association. All league matches suspended indefinitely. All players advised to enlist. Suddenly, the roar of the crowd was replaced by the sound of marching boots. Across the country, footballers traded in their kits for khaki. Entire teams signed up together. The Heart of Midlothian squad, a top Scottish club at the time, joined the war effort en masse, forming what would become known as McRae's Battalion. It was a patriotic gesture and a tragic one, because the front lines did not care who could take a corner kick or score from 30 yards. Footballers, once heroes in stadiums, now vanished into trenches, bayonets, and mud. For the fans, it was as if the soul of Saturday had been ripped away. Stadiums fell silent. Pitches overgrew. Balls gathered dust behind shuttered doors. Some tried to play unofficial matches, often for charity or morale. But they were quiet, somber affairs. The joy was dimmed by the knowledge that teammates, friends, and idols were missing, some never to return. In newspapers, you no longer found league tables. You found obituaries. Former Sheffield United midfielder killed in action. Everton winger, missing, presumed dead. It was a new kind of silence, one football had never known. But the game did not disappear entirely. In the most unexpected places, it endured. In army camps, soldiers shaped makeshift balls out of bundled socks and twine. In prisoner of war camps, football offered a few hours of escape from the wire and fear. Even near the trenches, between shellings, men kicked around whatever they could find, a ration tin, a lump of rubber, sometimes even a real ball smuggled from home. Because football had become something more than sport. It was normalcy. It was home. It was the last piece of a peaceful world, clung to by men surrounded by chaos. And then came Christmas, 1914. In a moment so surreal, it feels like a myth. British and German soldiers climbed from their trenches and met in the frozen space between them. They shared cigarettes, sang carols, and in some sectors, they played football. Not a proper match, not with referees or corner flags, but a rolling, joyful scramble between enemies who for just a moment were just men again. One German soldier recalled it years later. "We laughed, we cheered, we played, and then the war returned." But even that fleeting game, played in the snow with hands still stained by battle, showed the strange power football held. A power to restore, to humanize, even if just for an hour. Back home, people followed any scrap of football news they could find. Charity matches, fundraisers, local boys' leagues kept alive by stubborn organizers. But the core of the game, its heartbeat, had been stilled. And no one knew when, or if, it would return. By the end of World War I, an estimated 2,000 professional and amateur players had served. Many never came back. Clubs returned, eventually. The leagues reopened. But something was always missing. A generation had been lost. And the terraces, when they filled again, bore the weight of those absences. Still, the game had survived. Because even in the mud and misery, someone always kept kicking the ball. Not for glory, not for goals, but for memory and for hope. It was faint, uneven, like the heartbeat of something slowly coming back to life. And yet, in some cities, as spring returned and the fog lifted, you could once again hear the sound of a football thudding against brick, bouncing across the cobbles. When the First War ended in 1918, The world staggered forward in a kind of collective shell shock. Towns were quieter, families smaller, streets emptier. But football, scarred and limping, had survived. But not all teams returned in full. In the early 1920s, clubs across Britain reopened their gates. Many stadiums had fallen into disrepair. Some squads had lost nearly half their players. Fans returned, but with grief sitting heavy in the stands. At Arsenal, silence filled the gaps where entire rows of season ticket holders had once sat. At Preston North End, a local boy who had captained the youth team before the war came back without his right arm. Every club had its ghosts. Yet the game began again, and there was healing in its rhythm. The Football League resumed. Players old and new filled rosters. In the north of England, matches were rougher, more physical, more desperate, like the game itself was trying to forget what it had been through. Children, who had been too young to serve, now laced up boots for the first time. But even as football began to stabilize, Europe was unraveling again. But elsewhere, something new was blooming, a quiet respect for the sport's persistence. By the mid-1930s, tensions simmered from Berlin to Moscow. Fascist regimes rose, borders shifted, and old men who had once vowed never again now watched the drums of war beat once more. In 1939, it became official, and football, as it had before, braced for impact. This time, the bans came even faster. Britain was at war with Germany again. Within days of the declaration, all competitive matches were suspended. Players were encouraged to enlist. The Football League was officially shut down. So unlike the First World War, where football was largely erased, the Second World War saw it reshaped. It was morale. It was distraction. It was normal life. But there was one major difference from 1914. The government recognized that football had value beyond entertainment. They were unofficial. Local leagues were formed to keep spirits up. Teams were patched together with whoever wasn't serving. Matches were organized last minute, played on makeshift pitches, sometimes even indoors. Even as bombs fell nearby, fans gathered in small numbers to watch familiar kits take the field. And attendance, still high. Many professional players were called into service. Some were stationed near their home grounds and allowed to train on leave. In some areas, matches were paused mid-play so the crowd could rush into air raid shelters, only to return and finish the second half minutes later. Football was flexible now. It had learned how to survive. Others played for military teams while abroad. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to line up against local sides during their time off, boots still caked with trench mud, sleeves rolled up. In prisoner of war camps across Europe, football took on a strange new role. Captured British soldiers, stripped of nearly everything, formed secret clubs inside barbed wire fences. They built goalposts out of crates, balls from old uniforms and socks, lines from chalk, dust, or even scraped dirt. Some camps in Germany allowed limited organized sport, believing it kept prisoners docile. They were defiants. But for the men inside, the matches were more than games. They reminded everyone watching, guards included, that these were not just prisoners. They were players, citizens, humans, referees appointed. There are recorded accounts of POW leagues being formed. Standings were tracked. In one French camp, a Scottish prisoner was known for delivering passionate halftime talks that echoed down the barracks. His teammates called him captain, though they didn't need to. Even crude trophies fashioned from wood scraps. Meanwhile, in England, football endured under blackout curtains. He was their manager, their coach, and their hope. Matches were played in daylight to avoid nighttime bombings. And yet, the whistle blew. Some matches were moved underground, into warehouses, or converted tram depots. Fans brought ID cards in case of air raids, and people clapped, even through gloves and rationed coats. In 1942, a match at Stamford Bridge drew over 40,000 people, and the ball rolled. It wasn't a title match. It wasn't even for a trophy. But the pitch was still green, and the game still mattered. It told soldiers that home still existed. It became a language of its own, one spoken in every corner of a world breaking apart. Somehow, despite 2 global wars, football refused to vanish. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, the world looked almost unrecognizable. Cities were rubble, families broken, borders redrawn. But amid the debris of 2 global catastrophes, there were still empty pitches waiting to be played on. Somehow, after decades of trauma, the question returned: could football begin again? The answer came not in loud fanfare, but in quiet, hopeful moments. In working-class neighborhoods across England, boys once again kicked leather balls down alleys. Retired players emerged from the shadows, older, slower, but still holding something sacred in their stride. And stadiums bombed, burned or overgrown, were cleared, brick by brick, by volunteers and supporters, with nothing but hope and hand tools. They weren't just rebuilding grounds, they were rebuilding ritual. The Football League officially resumed in the 1946-47 season, barely a year after the war ended. And attendance, it surged beyond all expectation. After years of fear, grief and silence, people were desperate for something familiar. Something that didn't come with uniforms and sirens and telegrams. That season, over 41 million fans passed through the turnstiles, the highest total in English football history at the time. It wasn't perfect. Many players had lost their prime years to the war. Some teams were missing old captains who'd never returned. Kits were patched, stadium roofs leaked, and meals after matches were rationed. But the spirit, the feeling, was back. And in those early matches, fans didn't cheer for titles. They cheered for survival. Across Europe, the same rebirth was happening, each country in its own way. In Italy, players returned to the Serie A wearing black armbands and broken boots. In France, stadiums still bore scars from occupation. In Germany, football was banned entirely at first, part of the broader effort to dismantle all military-related structures. But by the early 1950s, even there, the game quietly returned. Because war had reminded everyone, football is not about borders. It's about belonging. In many towns, clubs began to take on new meaning. They weren't just sports teams anymore. They were symbols of recovery. Community hubs. Places where grief could be turned into cheer, even just for 90 minutes. Local businesses donated what they could. Supporters brought tools to help fix gates and stands. Children sold sweets outside to raise money for balls and boots. It was collective therapy, dressed in shin guards. And while players returned to their clubs, they also brought with them stories from the front. Some of them had played for POW leagues. Some had organized matches in desert outposts. Some had snuck balls into hospitals, using them as therapy for wounded comrades. These weren't stories about winning. They were stories about meaning. And they reminded fans everywhere that football had never truly stopped. It had just gone underground and come back stronger. One of the most moving examples came from Austria, where a young Jewish boy, displaced, orphaned, and alone, was adopted by a local club that had lost many of its players in the Holocaust. They didn't just give him a uniform. They gave him family. That boy would go on to become a regional football hero. Not because he scored the most goals, but because he proved that the game could outlive hate. In Britain, one of the most symbolic post-war moments came in 1948 with the London Olympic Games. Though still recovering, Britain hosted the world, and on a patchy pitch, under a gray sky, teams from war-torn countries played together. There were no big prizes, Just goals, handshakes, and applause. It was the first time in a decade that nations met without bullets between them. Just a ball. And so, football re-emerged. Not as a distraction from pain, but as a container for it. It allowed people to gather again, to sing again, to mourn what was lost, and imagine what could still be found. And with every pass, every whistle, every muddy save, something else returned too: hope. In the wake of war, as nations tried to patch themselves back together, football quietly spread its roots across borders, oceans, and languages. It had been played in trenches, prison camps, bomb shelters, and refugee fields. Now, it was time for it to be played everywhere. And for the first time, football wasn't just a sport or pastime. It was becoming a shared identity, a way to say, "We're still here, and we're ready to live again." By the early 1950s, countries across the world had their own football stories to tell. In Brazil, a new generation of barefoot players emerged from favelas and street games, inspired by stories of resilience from Europe. In Hungary, a golden team was forming, the mighty Magyars, who would go on to revolutionize football tactics and tear apart the traditional styles born before the wars. In West Africa, football was being used in schools, community fields, and independence movements. It was more than recreation, it was resistance, especially in colonized nations, still under foreign rule. And as each country recovered in its own way, football offered something few other things could: a level playing field. No matter your past, no matter your loss, no matter the rubble outside your city gates, you could kick a ball and for 90 minutes be part of something beautiful. That's why, in 1950, the return of the FIFA World Cup was more than a tournament. It was a global reunion. Held in Brazil, a country untouched by the worst of the war, it brought together teams who had fought on opposite sides just a few years earlier. England returned for the first time. Italy arrived with only a partially rebuilt team after losing many of their players in a tragic wartime plane crash. And Uruguay, the smallest of giants, shocked the world by winning it all. The crowds at Maracana Stadium were massive. The final match drew nearly 200,000 people, a record that still stands. But it wasn't just the numbers that mattered. It was the feeling in the air. For the first time in years, fans weren't hiding underground. They weren't waiting for air raids. They weren't checking papers at checkpoints. They were singing. They were chanting. They were living. And it didn't stop there. In 1954, Switzerland hosted the World Cup. In 1958, Sweden. Each time, the tournament became a mirror of the world's progress. More nations joined, more players emerged. And slowly, football was no longer just Europe's healing ritual. It was the world's. Back in England, clubs started international tours. Teams like Manchester United and Wolverhampton Wanderers played against foreign sides, carrying with them both the legacy of the wars and the vision of a shared future. These weren't just football matches. They were diplomatic gestures. Soft, leather-bound ambassadors rolling across green pitches, and when one player helped another up, when crowds clapped for opponents, when a goal was scored and fans from both sides cheered, that was football, writing a new chapter in human history. In Germany, football helped stitch together a broken nation. West Germany's victory in the 1954 World Cup final was more than an upset. It was a moment of national reawakening. The players were underdogs. The country was still rebuilding. But that final whistle against Hungary made millions of Germans believe, maybe for the first time since the war, that they could be proud of something again. They called it Das Wunder von Bern, the miracle of Bern. And it was. Because it showed that even nations once on the wrong side of history could find redemption through a game. Meanwhile, in South America, Africa, and Asia, football clubs were forming in places that had never hosted structured leagues before. UN workers brought balls into conflict zones. Missionaries taught street children how to dribble. Soldiers left behind tattered goalposts after peacekeeping missions, and local kids turned them into stadiums. The ball kept rolling, and the world kept chasing it. All by the 1960s, football wasn't just recovering from war. It had outgrown it. The war had given it something strange and bittersweet, a chance to prove itself not only as a game, but as a universal language. Because wherever you were, whoever you had lost, and however you were healing, the ball still made sense. There are no grandstands here, no lights, no chants ringing through the cold night air. Just a crumbling field behind a forgotten village, a goalpost half-rotted, and in the grass, a circle of stones that once marked midfield. Nobody's played here in decades, but listen closely, and you might still hear it. The echo of a kick, the quiet rhythm of something sacred. This is where the game still lives, not in spectacle, but in memory. All across Europe, there are places like this. Old POW camps, where inmates once scratched lines in the dirt. Tiny war memorials shaped like footballs. Abandoned military schools with rusted locker rooms and a pitch out back where the weeds now grow. No one visits them much. No one photographs them for social media. But these places matter, because football didn't survive the world wars through the famous stadiums. It survived in silence, in scraps, in shadows. In the Belgian countryside, a churchyard holds a simple grave. No name, just footballer, 1916. Locals say he was found with a stitched ball under his arm. They buried it with him. No team, no medals, just the idea of the game itself. And every spring, kids from nearby villages come play pickup matches nearby, not because anyone tells them to, but because the field feels right, as if it's still waiting. In a dusty archive in northern France, a caretaker preserves a letter written in pencil from a young soldier to his club. Tell the lads to keep training. I'll need a spot when I'm back. He never made it home, but his club still keeps a jersey in his honor, tucked behind the bar where fans meet after games. They raise a glass before the season starts. Just one. To him. In rural Poland, one farmer's barn has a wall covered in old match posters, propaganda games played during the occupation. His grandfather was forced to play under Nazi supervision. He hated it, but he played anyway. Because to play was to remember who he was, and who he wasn't. And in London, an elderly man still walks past his childhood club twice a week. He doesn't go in, just watches from across the street. He lost his father in the war, a striker, quick on his feet, quiet in the locker room. The club never retired his number, but the man doesn't mind. He says football isn't about numbers, it's about presence. And his father never really left the pitch. These stories don't make headlines. They're not in documentaries, but they're real. And they whisper a truth that modern football often forgets. This game isn't just about wins and trophies. It's about people, and the way they carry something fragile, something human, through the worst the world can offer. So if you ever find yourself on an old field, or passing a stadium gate marked with names you don't know, stop just for a second. Close your eyes and listen. Because somewhere, in the quiet between whistles, the game is still playing. And that brings us to the end of our journey. From muddy trenches to bombed-out fields. From silence to song, football endured. Because someone, somewhere, always kept the ball moving, even when the world stood still. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full of fields, fans, and forgotten goals. Today, football is everywhere. We watch it in massive stadiums. We stream it from our pockets. We chant for clubs with billion-dollar sponsorships. But beneath all the noise, beneath the camera angles, the chants and the lights, there are ghosts. Because football, more than most sports, is a game built on memory. And the wars left shadows that have never fully faded. Across England, many stadiums were rebuilt after the Second World War. Some had been bombed, others repurposed. A few were simply abandoned. But walk through them now, and you'll find tiny tributes in unexpected places. Plaques near the gates. Bronze busts of players who never returned. Names engraved on bricks below the fans' feet. They're easy to miss, but they're everywhere. At Hearts FC in Edinburgh, you'll find the names of every man who enlisted from the team in 1914. 7 of them never came home. Each year, fans gather for a moment of silence before a game, laying wreaths at the base of a simple memorial. It doesn't say much. It doesn't need to, because the silence says it all. In Sheffield, a mural shows players in vintage kits walking into fog, fading as they move forward, boots sinking into mud. It's not flashy, not meant to go viral. It's just there, waiting, like the memories it holds. And it's not alone. Many clubs across Europe have begun preserving wartime archives, matchbooks smudged with rain, letters from the front, training boots donated by the families of players who never made it back. The objects are worn, their owners long gone, but they remain part of the club's soul. In France, the national team keeps a registry of players lost during both world wars. In Germany, wartime football posters are displayed in museums, carefully explaining how even propaganda games played a role in the sport's survival. And in Poland, several pitches were rebuilt atop ruins, with nothing but a small wooden sign to mark what had once stood there. These are not glamorous stories, but they're real. And for football, they matter, because every time a new player walks onto a pitch, every time a fan pulls on a jersey, every time the whistle blows, there's a thread, invisible but unbroken, that leads back to a match played in a trench, or a corner flag raised in a prison yard, or a ball stitched together in secret, so a few men could feel like themselves again. Modern players know this too. In 2014, the Premier League marked the 100-year anniversary of the Christmas truce. Clubs across England wore poppy emblems on their kits. A ceremony before kickoff featured 2 youth teams, one in British khaki, the other in vintage German attire, shaking hands at midfield. They didn't speak. They just stood there, because the message was already clear. And every year on Remembrance Day, clubs across Europe fall silent before kickoff, not just for soldiers, but for the lost games, the teammates, the seasons that never happened. In that moment, even the biggest stadium feels small, like a chapel with grass instead of pews. And then the whistle blows, and the game begins again, because that's what football has always done. There are also personal tributes. Players like James Mearns, a goalkeeper who returned from war with a limp, became a youth coach and trained hundreds of boys in a backyard pitch. He never played professionally again, but every one of his students knew his story. Or the unnamed soldier who carved his unit's logo into an old ball, buried it in Belgium, and left a note, "Let someone play with this when peace comes." It was found nearly 60 years later, still intact. Football has never claimed to be noble, but it has always been human. It breaks, bruises, and forgets, but it also forgives, rebuilds, and remembers. And in that remembering, it honors everything it lost. Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight we begin a quiet journey back through the centuries, into the raw, unpolished heart of a game we all think we know. But this isn't the football of clean stadiums and neat touchlines. No bright kits, no VAR, no referees shouting into earpieces. This is where football began. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let the tension leave your body. Let the fog roll in. And imagine a village half drowned in mud somewhere in medieval England. The year, let's say 1321. The houses are huddled together like sheep against the cold. They're thatched and leaning, blackened by smoke and soaked with drizzle. Chickens scratch at the wet earth. A dog barks once, then disappears around a corner. And across the village green, men and women are gathering, dressed in wool and leather, stomping the cold out of their boots. Someone's holding a ball. Or what passed for a ball, a heavy bundle of stitched leather, packed with straw, or sometimes pig's bladder, if the tanner was in a generous mood. It's lumpy, wet, and weirdly organic, and it's about to become the center of the universe. This is what historians today call folk football, the earliest known version of the game. It wasn't just one game with one name. It had dozens of local variations and was played differently in every region, sometimes even village to village. But the spirit was always the same, rough, rowdy, and lawless. There were no teams in the way we understand them now. Sometimes it was one half of the town versus the other. Other times, it was married men against bachelors. And occasionally, it was just a giant mass of players, each trying to kick, carry, or chase the ball toward whatever had been agreed on that year as a goal. A church gate, a tree stump, a specific rock, or just the stream past the smithy. The boundaries? There were none. A single game could span multiple fields, muddy roads, rivers, courtyards, and occasionally barge right through someone's garden. Play didn't stop. Not for fences, not for market stalls, not for livestock. If the ball rolled under a cart, so did the players. If it ended up in the bakery, the chase continued through the flour dust. It was football, but it was also something else, a ritual, a pressure valve, a celebration, and a fight, all in one. Most of these early games were tied to festivals or feast days, especially Shrove Tuesday, the day before Lent. It was the perfect time for release. You'd been to church. You'd confessed your sins. Now it was time to run through the streets, ankle deep in mud, grappling with your neighbors for glory. These weren't just quick scrimmages. Some games lasted for hours. Others went for days. If the ball was still in motion and the players still breathing, the game continued. There were no referees, no time limit, and no clear rules, only custom, chaos, and community. It wasn't uncommon for players to show up with fists taped and bones already bruised from previous years. Elbows flew, scraps broke out, and yet this wasn't considered a problem. It was expected, part of the appeal. It was football, yes, but it was also controlled mayhem, a licensed kind of violence, an echo of warfare softened into play. The ball itself wasn't always kicked. In some versions of the game, it could be thrown, carried, hidden, or wrestled away. Sometimes it was kicked through a goal, sometimes into a barrel, sometimes just pushed over a line, made of hay, or scratched into the dirt. And every once in a while, in the darker corners of legend, it wasn't a ball at all. There's an old story told in several towns across England, always in hushed tones and with no small amount of theatrical shivering, about a match that was played using the head of a vanquished enemy. These tales are almost certainly apocryphal, more myth than memory, but they speak to the game's wild reputation. This wasn't a gentleman's pastime. It was a game of the people, and the people were tough, muddy, and hungry for release. Now picture this. In the village of Laxton, Nottinghamshire, two opposing sides, separated by a river, take the field. The ball is hurled into the air, and instantly the crowd surges forward. Dozens of feet churn the earth. The ball vanishes under a tangle of limbs. Shouting fills the air. Someone cheers, someone falls, a dog howls. A man with a blackened tooth charges through the mud, snatches the ball, and heaves it toward a line of barrels by the tavern. It ricochets off a wall and rolls into a horse trough. Laughter explodes. A group of young boys sprint after it, their faces flushed red with cold and joy. Nearby, an old woman rings a handbell, not to stop the game, just to announce that the stew is ready. Life continues around the match. The smith's forge burns quietly. The baker checks his loaves. But everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest farmer, knows what day it is. It's football day. And that means everything else can wait. This wasn't a game for prestige. No one got famous. There were no scouts, no leagues, no scribes keeping score. You played because it was tradition. You played because it made you feel alive. And you played because it brought the village together in one messy, joyful, muddy moment. It's easy now, centuries later, to look back on this as barbaric. And yes, it was brutal. Bones were broken, teeth were lost. Occasionally, worse. But for those who lived it, this wasn't senseless violence. It was a release from winter, from work, from the weight of life itself. In that way, it was deeply human. So as the sun begins to lower over this 14th century village, and the shouting drifts like mist through the alleyways, we step back quietly. Let the sound of boots on mud fade. Let the warmth of the tavern fires glow in the distance. Because in our next section, we'll stay right here, but shift our focus. We'll begin to explore what happened when kings and clergy decided this game had gone too far, and how a ball rolling through the mud became a symbol of defiance across centuries. But for now, just breathe. Let the chaos drift away. You're safe here, in a quieter corner of history. The noise of the match was impossible to ignore. It spilled down alleyways, echoed off the stone church walls, and drifted into every open window. The village was caught in a kind of beautiful madness. Feet pounding against dirt, shouts rising and falling, hands grasping and pushing through sweat and laughter. But not everyone was entertained. Because high above these muddy games in courts, cathedrals, and city councils, a very different sentiment was spreading. Football was becoming a problem. To the villagers, it was a festival, a moment of joy carved out from hard lives. But to rulers, bishops, and town magistrates, football looked like something else entirely, a threat to order. And it was. Let's not romanticize it too much. These weren't quiet Sunday strolls. Folk football matches were wild, often violent, and totally unpredictable. Shops closed early to avoid broken windows. Merchants boarded up their stalls. Mothers pulled their children indoors. In bigger towns, the local constables were outnumbered. The ball was an excuse for chaos. It didn't matter if you were noble or not. If the ball came your way, you were suddenly part of the match, like it or not. The first major royal response came in 1314, when King Edward II issued an official proclamation banning football in London. The language was direct. For as much as there is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls, we forbid on pain of imprisonment such game to be used in the city in the future. It wasn't about morality. It was about noise, disturbance, and control. London was already a city of tight alleyways and timber buildings. Football matches tore through neighborhoods, upset merchants, and blocked church processions. So Edward banned it. And the people ignored him. Over the next 2 centuries, football was banned more than 30 times by royal decree. Edward III, Richard II, Henry IV, and Edward IV all took turns trying to shut it down. Sometimes, the reason was noise. Other times, it was archery. Yes, archery. In medieval England, the king expected men to practice with longbows on holy days. Football, they argued, distracted young men from honing their military skills. And in an age where war with France could erupt at any moment, archery wasn't optional. Parliament even passed statutes demanding that men not play football so they could spend more time practicing their aim. It's hard to imagine now a leather ball competing with national defense, but that's how widespread football had become. Even in the 1300s, the pull of the game was strong enough to worry a king. Then came the church. Priests, monks, and bishops had their own complaints. It wasn't just the shouting, though they disliked that too. Football often took place on holy days, directly competing with services. The people, quite literally, left the sermon to chase a ball through the mud. In some villages, matches disrupted church bells. In others, fights broke out near graveyards. There are even records of football being played across churchyards, with players accidentally toppling headstones. One chronicler in York complained that the holy rest is defiled by wild games, where men forget God and remember only violence. To the church, football was a spiritual distraction, loud, earthly, and untamed, and that made it dangerous. But still, the people played. The bands, no matter how stern or frequent, couldn't stop the matches. Why? Because football was more than entertainment. It was expression, a rare time when the rigid rules of medieval life briefly loosened. On most days, a peasant had little say in how they lived. Their labor, their taxes, their allegiance, all dictated. But on football day, they could push back. Not with swords, but with their bodies, not with protests, but with play. In that ball, they carried a kind of rebellion, not just against the lord of the manor, but against the very structure of medieval society. The game didn't respect titles or land. Everyone was equal when the ball dropped. Some towns took it further. In Alnwick, in northern England, a match was held every year between rival manors. The goals were over a mile apart, and the ball had to be carried, not kicked, through rivers, hills, and thorny woods. The match was as much a test of endurance as it was of skill. In Derbyshire, the Shrovetide game included hundreds of players. The ball was so heavy, it took 2 hands to lift. Local shops boarded up days in advance. The town simply surrendered itself to the game. Despite the threats of imprisonment, football days were often treated like unofficial holidays, and no amount of parchment sealed with royal wax could convince the villagers otherwise. It's worth noting that nobles sometimes played too, but always under different rules. In castles, football was cleaner, safer, smaller in scale, more of a diversion than a spectacle. But among the poor and the working classes, the wild version remained dominant, a tangle of mud, muscle, and mayhem. This divide only deepened the problem for authorities. They couldn't suppress something that was woven into the people's lives. Football wasn't imposed from above. It rose from the ground, organic, messy, and beloved. And that made it hard to kill. What's fascinating is how resilient the game was. It didn't shrink under pressure. It adapted. Some towns moved matches out of central streets to avoid police attention. Others invented fake parades to hide the opening kickoff. A few started the games in complete silence, only to erupt in chaos once the ball was rolling. Even the names changed. To hide their plans, locals began calling football by other terms, the chase, the roll, or simply the game, but the meaning was the same. The ball, heavy and awkward, still tumbled through the dirt. And the people, ignored and scolded the rest of the year, still came running after it. As we end this section, imagine once more a quiet market town, its streets muddy and its sky low with clouds. In a back alley, a dozen boys whisper over a worn leather ball. Behind a bakery, a circle of men talk strategy in hushed tones. The proclamation banning the match was nailed to the church door, but no one's reading it. Because this isn't rebellion in the way history remembers it. It's simpler. It's just football, and it refuses to die. The match was over, at least for now. In the muddy fields just outside town, what remained of the ball had come to rest in a shallow puddle. The leather casing was torn, the stitching half gone, but no one seemed to mind. A boy retrieved it and held it high, earning a cheer from a dozen grimy figures limping back toward the tavern. Another game in the books. Another year survived. And though no prize had been awarded, and no final score remembered, something sacred had been fulfilled. This is where the next phase of football's journey quietly began, not in palaces or universities, but in places like this, village greens, riverbanks, back roads, and barnyards. The bans had failed, the decrees were ignored, and the game, against all odds, endured. But it didn't remain unchanged. What started as a chaotic, free-for-all brawl began to settle. Not because anyone wanted to tame it, but because generation after generation of players slowly added shape, pattern, habit. Some of these traditions began unintentionally. A specific path for the ball, a preferred side of the village, one family always starting the kickoff. Over time, these habits hardened into rules, not formal, written ones, but spoken, passed down and understood. In the town of Sedgefield, for example, there was a rule that the ball could not be carried, only kicked. In Workington, the teams were divided by where you were born. And in Atherstone, the match always began at the market square, no matter how crowded, with the ball tossed from the upper window of a shop. Each town had its version. Each game had its legends. Some communities developed rituals to open play, a song, a bell, a drink shared among the captains. Others had a closing tradition, a meal, a local toast, or the burning of the worn-out ball. These weren't rules, in the modern sense. There were still no referees, no written guidebook. But the chaos of the early centuries was giving way to something more rhythmic, less violent, perhaps, or at least more structured in its violence. In some places, the matches became annual affairs, tied to local festivals or seasonal changes. The game was no longer just a sport, it was part of the village calendar, a cultural anchor. Children grew up watching the match. Teenagers waited for their first chance to join. Elders sat in doorways, recalling the time they had scored the winning goal or taken a broken nose in good humor. Football became storytelling, a living legend that played out each year like clockwork. And even when the match was over, the stories never stopped. Who scored the goal? Who outran the pack? Who tackled whom? Who was covered in the most mud? These details became folk history, shared in pubs and markets, passed down like family heirlooms. This phase of the game, from roughly the 15th to the 18th century, was football in transition. Still wild, still fiercely local, but slowly hardening into something that could last longer than just an afternoon. Some towns even made physical changes to accommodate the game. In Ashbourne, the goalposts were moved slightly each decade as the village expanded. In Kirkwall, Scotland, shopkeepers built stronger shutters just for the festival match. In St. Ives, the game grew so popular that spectators carved hillside seating into a slope overlooking the pitch, not because the town wanted to promote the game, but because they couldn't stop it. So they worked around it. In many of these villages, footballs were handmade in winter and kept safe until match day. The task of constructing them, sewing leather panels, filling the core with horsehair or pig's bladder, and sealing the seams with wax, was often done in secret and by someone the community trusted. The ball had a kind of totemic status. It wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol. To touch it was to join history. To kick it was to declare you were part of something older than yourself. And to lose it in a ditch, a river, or a rooftop was to stop the match. In some villages, if the ball was lost, play could not resume for another year. That sense of ritual gave the game meaning beyond sport. In Clun, it was said that whoever scored the first goal would find good fortune in marriage. In Launceston, the ball was passed around the town square and kissed by elders before the match, as if the game itself were a living spirit. It wasn't just about kicking and chasing. It was identity. A shared act that reminded the community who they were and what they valued: strength, endurance, cleverness, unity, and tradition. Of course, the game still had its dangers. Broken bones were still common. Fights still erupted. But something had changed in the tone. Instead of random chaos, the violence now carried a ceremonial weight. It was expected. even respected, as long as it stayed within the boundaries of the match. If someone took a blow during the game, they might grimace and limp to the edge of the crowd, but they'd be back the next year, proud of their scar, eager to play again. In this way, football became a ritual of resilience, proof that the village could take a beating and keep standing. Not all the changes were deliberate. In some towns, the influence of nearby schools began to creep in. Young boys who had attended grammar academies, often sponsored by the church, returned home with ideas of positions, passing, or drills. They tried to apply these concepts to their local match. Sometimes they were mocked, sometimes they were ignored. But other times, the ideas stuck. Let's play with sides. Let's have 3 forwards and 2 stay behind. Let's make a rule: no kicking above the knee. It was the earliest murmur of something that, centuries later, would become team structure. But back then, it was just another part of the evolving village game. And so the ball kept rolling. Year after year. Through mud, through frost, through broken fences and toppled carts. It was still wild, still loud, still impossible to fully contain. But it had changed. It now had roots. And in our next section, we'll explore how this local ritual began to spread further into schools, into cities, and eventually into the first attempts at organizing football as we know it today. But for now, let the village grow quiet again. Let the crowd disperse. And let that torn old ball rest in the puddle. Until next year, let's return, now to a quieter kind of pitch. Not the rutted village green. Not the waterlogged alley where pigs roam and children shout. This time, we're somewhere different. A schoolyard, mid-17th century, England. The wind rustles a row of tall oaks. Students in long coats and scuffed boots kick a ball made of stitched leather across the lawn. It's crude, just like in the villages, but already something has changed. There's form, intention. One boy calls out positions. You 2 hold the back line. Another shouts, don't dribble, pass. There are no referees, no lines, no nets. But what's happening here is historic. Football is evolving from folk tradition into something structured, and much of that change begins not in towns or taverns, but in England's public schools. By the late 1600s, education for wealthy boys often included outdoor play. This wasn't viewed as leisure. It was considered character building, a way to prepare future leaders for hardship, strategy, and self-control. Naturally, football found a home there. But schools couldn't tolerate chaos. They needed order, discipline. And so, for the first time, the game was broken into rules, simple at first, then more specific. At Ayton, the ball could be carried in certain zones, but not others. At Harrow, you could catch the ball, but only for 3 seconds. At Rugby, famously, a student named William Webb Ellis is said to have picked up the ball and run with it, accidentally giving rise to an entirely new sport. These weren't national laws. They weren't shared, but they were written down, the first step toward football's codification. Each school had its version. Each rulebook was fiercely defended. For decades, this created friction. When former students met on holidays or traveled between cities, they brought their rules with them, and when 2 different systems collided, arguments broke out. Imagine a match between boys from Eton and Westminster. One side says you can handle the ball. The other side insists that's cheating. Confusion, disputes, matches abandoned mid-play. So much of early football's frustration and potential came from this lack of uniformity. Everyone was playing the same spirit of the game, but no one was playing the same version. That's when something unexpected happened. Not from above, not from kings or priests, but from players themselves. By the early 1800s, former students, laborers, merchants, and apprentices were all forming clubs. Not formal ones at first, just loosely organized groups of friends who met in parks or open fields. They played every Sunday, then twice a week. Then eventually they started keeping score. Clubs like Sheffield FC and Notts County, some of the oldest in the world, emerged from this era. And with clubs came the need for common ground, a universal code, a language the game could finally share. In 1848, a group of Cambridge students from different schools met to solve the problem. They drafted what became known as the Cambridge Rules, one of the earliest attempts to unify the game. It allowed for kickoffs, throw-ins, and no hands. It defined fouls and offside positioning. It even introduced goal areas. It wasn't perfect. Not everyone agreed to use it, but it laid the groundwork. Others followed. In 1857, the Sheffield Rules added further structure. In 1863, the Football Association FA was founded in London. For the first time in its wild, muddy history, football had an official rule book and a name to go with it: Association Football, or, as it came to be known, simply football. But not everyone welcomed the change. Traditionalists, especially in the North, resisted. To them, football wasn't supposed to be neat. It wasn't meant to be regulated. The mud, the blood, the chaos, that was the point. You could no more regulate football than you could a thunderstorm. Clubs split. Some embraced the new rules. Others broke off and formed their own leagues, some of which eventually evolved into rugby. The game splintered briefly. But slowly, steadily, standardized football gained ground. Why? Because it allowed the game to grow, to spread, to be played between towns, across counties, and eventually across borders. And it did. By the late 1800s, football was no longer just a local tradition. It was a movement. Newspapers began printing match results. Clubs drew paying crowds. Teams developed uniforms. Friendly matches became competitions. And players became legends in their own lifetimes. But beneath all of it, beneath the polished boots and velvet caps, the old spirit still flickered. The mud, the roar, the stubborn joy. It had survived. And so the game had grown up. But it hadn't forgotten where it came from. It carried in its rules the fingerprints of those muddy villagers who chased the ball into streams. It carried in its formations the echoes of old schoolboys barking orders across the pitch. And it carried in its heart the same desire that had always driven it: to play, to gather, to release. In the next part of our story, we'll dive deeper into that transformation as clubs rise, leagues form, and football begins to cross oceans, borders, and cultures. But for now, the field grows quiet again. And in a worn schoolyard behind a stone chapel, a single ball rests beneath an oak tree, still, waiting. Because history never really stops rolling. The ship pulled out of Liverpool Harbor with the usual cargo: coal, textiles, steel. But somewhere on board, tucked into a crate, a worn leather football made the crossing too. It wasn't a planned export. There was no marketing campaign, no federation, no plan, just a ball and a handful of workers, engineers or soldiers who brought with them the game they loved. And that's how it began, not with a grand unveiling, but with a match played on the deck of a steamship, or in a dusty square in Buenos Aires, or on the edge of a construction site in Calcutta. Wherever the British Empire went, football followed. But here's what no one expected. The world didn't just receive football. It claimed it, reshaped it, and in time, played it even better. By the late 1800s, football had taken root far beyond England's industrial north. In Uruguay, dock workers played on patches of dirt beside cargo yards. In South Africa, miners kicked battered balls between shifts. In India, students and soldiers created hybrid versions of the game, mixing local traditions with British rules. And in Brazil, a young man named Charles Miller, educated in England, returned to São Paulo with 2 footballs in his suitcase, unknowingly planting the seed of a legend. What started as a colonial pastime quickly outgrew its colonial frame. Football wasn't just a British export anymore. It was a global obsession. And wherever it arrived, it carried with it both freedom and conflict. In colonized nations, football became a way to resist, to gather in public, to organize, to beat the colonizers at their own game. In India, Mohun Bagan, an all-Indian club, defeated a British regiment in 1911. For many, it wasn't just a match. It was a political moment, a spark of pride and defiance. In Algeria, Brazil, and Ghana, football became an instrument of identity, a way to prove, on a level pitch, that greatness knew no flag or bloodline. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the game was changing too. In 1904, the International Football Federation FIFA was founded in Paris. Initially a small governing body, it soon grew into the center of a new global order. By 1930, the first FIFA World Cup was held in Uruguay. 13 teams participated, mostly from the Americas and Europe. The stadium was half-built. There were no qualifiers. The trophy was modest, but the dream was enormous. And that tournament would go on to shape the future of sport forever. War would halt that future twice. World War I and II interrupted leagues, delayed competitions, and took countless players away from the game. Entire stadiums were repurposed. Football fields became camps and airstrips. But even in the trenches, football found its way back. In the famous Christmas truce of 1914, German and British soldiers climbed out of their trenches, shook hands, and played football in no man's land. No referees, no goals, just a ball. For a few hours, the war stopped, and the game carried on. After World War II, football exploded. Radio made it a household ritual. Television made it a global performance. The World Cup became a spectacle. Players became icons, not just athletes, but cultural giants. Pelé, Maradona, Cruyff, Beckenbauer, Zidane, each carried not just their country's hopes, but the legacy of a game that had once been played in muddy fields by barefoot boys and bruised villagers. And what of those muddy fields? They're still out there. In corners of the world, far from camera flashes and billion-dollar stadiums, kids still gather with a ball made of rags or plastic bags tied with string. They don't know the FA's founding year. They don't care about possession statistics. They play because it feels like flying, because it connects them to something bigger, older, and strangely magical. From Laxton to Lagos, from a Shrovetide riot to a Champions League final, from forbidden peasant chaos to billion-dollar industry, football didn't just survive the centuries, it thrived. Because it speaks a language deeper than strategy, deeper than rules. It speaks of play, of movement, of joy, of longing, of home. And so, as we close the story of football's brutal origins, let's pause. Let's remember the boy with no shoes who scored past a keeper twice his size. Let's remember the priest who tried and failed to ban the local match. Let's remember the muddy, nameless villagers who kept chasing a ball long after sundown, long after the law said they shouldn't, because they are football. And you, listening now, are part of that same echo. So rest now. Let the stadium fade into quiet. Let the chants soften into lullaby. Let the old leather ball come to a stop in the center of a forgotten field. And know that the game will never end. It's always waiting. Just a ball, and the promise that someone, somewhere, will come running after it. The smoke hung low over Sheffield. It was 1857, and England was changing. Coal dust filled the streets. Factories roared. Railways sliced through hillsides like iron veins. Children carried buckets to feed machines. Men clocked in before sunrise. Cities were growing fast, chaotic and crowded. And in the evenings, after the last shift ended, they played. Not in muddy village greens anymore, but in rail yards, worn city lots, patches of grass tucked behind mills. And the game? Still football. But now, something was different. It had a name, a club, and for the first time, a future. The first recognized football club, Sheffield FC, was born not in a castle or cathedral, but in a tavern. Two friends, Nathaniel Creswick and William Prest, both members of a local cricket club, decided that winters were far too dull. They loved sport, they loved structure, and they knew football had potential. But it couldn't remain a free-for-all. So they wrote rules, their rules. They banned running with the ball, they added throw-ins, they formalized free kicks. The Sheffield rules were still a little chaotic, but far more orderly than the muddy brawls of old. Soon, other clubs followed. Notts County, Hallam, Wanderers, each forming from small communities of men who wanted something more permanent than the annual village match. These clubs weren't professional. Not yet. They were made up of butchers, clerks, bakers, blacksmiths, and students. Some matches had entrance fees, usually a penny. Uniforms were minimal. Goals were sometimes just hats laid on the ground. But the crowds grew. So did the stakes. And the question no one wanted to ask started creeping in. Should players be paid? You see, early football was considered a gentleman's game, especially in the South. Amateurs, volunteers, no money, just glory. But in the North, where factory workers dominated the clubs, that idea didn't sit so well. If you lost a day's wages to play a match, why shouldn't you be compensated? If the club made money from ticket sales, why shouldn't the players? The split grew. Southern clubs clung to tradition, football as noble leisure. Northern clubs leaned toward professionalism, football as labor. By the 1880s, the rift had widened into a full-blown philosophical war. Some accused professional clubs of corrupting the sport. Others countered that working men deserved the same respect as anyone else, especially when thousands turned out to watch them play. The FA resisted at first. They threatened to ban clubs that paid players. But in 1885, after mounting pressure, the Football Association finally gave in. Professionalism was legalized. The game would never be the same. And so began a new era. Tactics emerged. Formations solidified. Kit designs evolved. In 1888, the first official league, the English Football League, was formed, with 12 clubs competing in a proper season. For the first time, the sport wasn't just a pastime, it was a career. And behind every club was a community, proud, noisy, loyal. Factories and streets now had teams of their own. Rivalries formed not just between cities, but within them, between neighborhoods, between faiths, even between family lines. Football became something even larger than sport. It became identity. On a Saturday afternoon, a man who worked 6 days a week in the ironworks could stand on the touchline, scarf in hand, and watch his team defend the pride of the town. It wasn't just about goals. It was about belonging. About finding something to hold on to in an age of massive change. And still, the old spirit clung to the edges. Even as clubs grew and stadiums appeared and ticket prices rose, there was still mud, still songs, still the wildness that had always lived in the game. When the ball rolled into the stands, a boy chased it. When the referee wasn't looking, an elbow found a rib. And when the final whistle blew, win or lose, the pub filled with stories, half true, half remembered, all beloved. The match might end, but the game never really did. By the dawn of the 20th century, football had become one of the most watched, discussed, and cherished parts of British life. But it wouldn't stay there for long. Soon, the ships would leave Liverpool, the steamers would cross the channel, and a battered old football would roll out onto foreign shores. In the next and final section of our story, we'll follow the game as it leaves England and begins to conquer the world. But for now, listen to the distant sound of a whistle, feel the weight of wool kits and leather boots, and picture a goal scored in front of 200 people that no one would forget for the rest of their life.